If you're watching or listening to a podcast like this, then you almost definitely know the more popular Stoic philosophers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. They're extremely popular and influential today, and there's even kind of a cult religion that's grown up around them. And part of why they're popular, and one of the big appeals of Stoicism, is how practical it is. They're not arguing about whether this couch that I'm sitting on is real or not. They're talking about how to live a better life. But the world of practical, day-to-day useful philosophy is a lot bigger than those two, and a lot bigger than just Stoicism. And one of my favorite philosophers who's a great next step if you're digging into practical philosophy is Montaigne. Now, Montaigne's a pretty interesting guy as philosophers go. He was born into a rich family and did the normal rich kid things until 28 when he retired to his castle, tower, however you want to call it, to surround himself with his 1,500 books and just write in isolation for the next 10 years. During that time, he wrote his essays. And if you've ever read a blog post, then you owe a little bit of that to Montaigne, because he was one of the first writers to really popularize the essay. In his essays, he covers a huge variety of topics, everything from how to be mentally tougher, how to manage jealousy and envy, how to read and learn better, how to temper our wealth and ambition, and sensibly the benefits of solitude, which he lived in for those 10 years. And like the popular Stoics that I mentioned at the beginning, he has this extremely readable, practical, advice-heavy style, but is a little more fun and jaunty. He's kind of self-deprecating, he's silly, he goes on these random tangents at times. It makes it pretty fun to read, if I'm being honest. But as you can see if you're watching this is an 800-page tome of essays. There's a ton in here. So I picked some of my favorite essays and topics from the essays to share with you today. They're in an order that I think made sense and kind of follows the structure of the essays, but you can also jump around based on the timestamps if you want to. So let's just jump into the benefits of solitude, because this is a really big topic in his work. It's something that I think is kind of a popular idea today, talking about disconnecting, getting away from the noise, not listening to podcasts all the time. And he was obviously a huge advocate of using solitude to your intellectual, emotional advantage. And he actually has a whole essay called Of Solitude. And right off the bat, he clarifies that a lot of people have the wrong idea about solitude. He says, the aim of all solitude, I take it, is the same, to live more at leisure and at one's ease. But people do not always look for the right way. Often they think they have left business and they have only changed it. There is scarcely less trouble in governing a family than in governing an entire state. Whatever the mind is wrapped up in, it is all wrapped up in it. And domestic occupations are no less importunate for being less important. Furthermore, by getting rid of the court and the marketplace, we do not get rid of the principal worries of our life. Reason and sense remove anxiety, not villas that look out upon the sea. And I should mention here that that last sentence about reason and sense remove anxiety, not villas that look out upon the sea, that's actually a quotation from the Roman philosopher Horace. Montaigne has this very interesting writing style where he weaves quotations from others straight into his sentences. So I might have to break occasionally and let you know which parts were quotations. He's saying something kind of interesting here. And this is something we talked about in Finite and Infinite Games and in Straw Dogs, where we have this kind of warped idea of relaxation today, where we think of a vacation or even meditation or a weekend as a way to recharge for getting back into the thick of our lives. But that's not really relaxation, because there is still some latent concern over getting back to the things that we have been letting sit for that period. And I'm going to use these terms like solitude, relaxation, and stuff a little bit interchangeably, because this is translated from French. You could make an argument that some of what he's talking about is kind of like retirement or relaxation as well. But one of the things he's saying with solitude is that it's not enough to simply stop working a job and take care of your children. You need to actually be alone and have no other obligations or things to worry about or things to get back to in order to get the full benefits of this. And so it's something that probably most of us have never experienced in our lives. And it might even be very hard to do today, because you can always go on social media and find some new thing to be worried about. And travel is another thing that often doesn't meet these criteria of proper solitude, proper removal from the stresses of life. He later says, someone said to Socrates that a certain man had grown no better by his travels. I should think not, he said. He took himself along with him. Why should we move to find countries and climates of another kind? What exile leaves himself behind? That last sentence is, again, from Horace. Montaigne continues, if a man does not first unburden his soul of the load that weighs upon it, movement will cause it to be crushed still more. As in a ship, the cargo is less cumbersome when it is settled. And I love this analogy that if you have all of this weight on you, traveling or going somewhere is actually going to make it worse because you've kind of upset all of it. I've certainly noticed this traveling with children. It's not necessarily more relaxing sometimes because sure, you might be getting away from work, but some of these other weights in your life, some of these other challenges have been tossed about in the chaos of going to a new location. So if you can't unburden your soul where you are by disconnecting from the things that are weighing upon it, whether that's work or some other obligation, then travel is not going to magically give you that mental peace you're looking for. And he actually goes so far as to say that true solitude also means detaching from basically all the other people in your life. And this is where it gets kind of extreme because he apparently did really isolate himself for 10 years. I'm sure he had some social contact, but it sounds like he was pretty alone for that period. He says, since God gives us leisure to make arrangements for moving out, let us make them. Let us pack our bags. Let us take an early leave of the company. Let us break free from the violent clutches that engage us elsewhere and draw us away from ourselves. Let the other things be ours, but not be joined and glued to us so strongly that they cannot be detached without tearing off our skin and some part of our flesh as well. The greatest thing in the world is to know how to belong to oneself. He's saying kind of two things here. One, that in retirement, right, close to death, you should kind of almost remove yourself from society and like practice being dead in a sense. And it's kind of a recurring Stoic theme that you want to practice death in various ways, but he's talking about it in a different way, which is one, that if you can disengage yourself from all of the obligations of society, then you are somewhat less afraid to die, less afraid to be alone, but also you're kind of helping the people around you if you practice doing that too. I don't know, it's a little bit morbid, but this idea that I like here is this concept that let the other things be ours, but not joined and glued to us so strongly that they cannot be detached without tearing off our skin. I like that idea that you can be committed to something can be very important to you as long as it's not so important that its loss would ruin you. I mean, I think that definitely has limits. Like, I don't think this should apply to family members, but I think some people might treat their job that way, or some of their possessions, or some other parts of their life that aren't the people they love. And Montaigne's saying that you want to make sure that none of those other things in your life have that kind of hold on you. Maybe he's saying that about family too, but I'm not entirely sure. And then he goes on to say that one of the hardest things about this is our pleasures. And there are really these two kinds of pleasures that we should be aware of. The sages teach us often enough to beware of the treachery of our appetites and to distinguish true and entire pleasures from pleasures that are mixed and streaked with a preponderance of pain. For most pleasures, they say, caress and embrace us only to strangle us, like those thieves that the Egyptians called Philistus. If we got our headache before getting drunk, we should take care not to drink too much. But pleasure, to deceive us, walks ahead and hides her sequel from us. And this is kind of an interesting idea about pleasure and happiness. So maybe you're familiar with the philosophy utilitarianism, where in some formulations of it, you just want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And that was really popularized by Jeremy Bentham. Maybe I'll cover him at some point. But then John Stuart Mill came along later and he proposed another form of utilitarianism where there are actually two kinds of pleasures, which is very similar to what Montaigne is saying here. There are these higher intellectual pleasures that are kind of pleasures in and of themselves. And that could be something like talking to someone you love. And then there are these base pleasures that have this caress and embrace us only to strangle us, right? And so that could be getting drunk, doing drugs, various forms of sloth and other indulgences that are these lower pleasures you want to avoid. And those are the kinds of things that he was saying in the previous section you can engage in, but you don't want to let them have their hold on you. And I think the way it fits in with this solitude topic is that it's not just about removal from other people and from society, it's also about removal from the pleasures and indulgences of life that also end up harming us. And one of those pleasures, and this is a topic we're going to come back to a little bit later, is ambition. Because he says the humor most directly opposite to retirement is ambition. Glory and repose are things that cannot lodge in the same dwelling. As far as I can see, these men have only their arms and legs outside the crowd. Their souls, their intentions are more than ever in the thick of it. And then slightly further on, he says, it is impossible to abandon occupations if you do not abandon the fruits of them. Therefore, rid yourself of all care for reputation and glory. And he's really beautifully explaining this topic we've touched on a few times now, that you're simply not actually relaxing or actually taking time for yourself if it is a means to these other kind of indulgent ends, so to speak. The businessman's vacation so that he can go back to enslaving away to buy things that he doesn't need to impress people he doesn't like, whatever the Fight Club line is. Right? Like, that's not really vacation. It's not really relaxation. You're not really enjoying solitude. You need to fully emotionally detach from those things to truly enjoy your time with yourself and to truly know yourself and to truly be comfortable in your own skin, truly relax, I guess, for lack of a better word here. That is most of what he talks about in the On Solitude chapter, but there's one more bit about solitude versus idleness that I want to touch on as well, because this is where he kind of has a tiny bit of conflict with what John Gray was talking about in the Straw Dogs episode, which I think was number 2. And Gray was really advocating for bringing idleness back, being able to be idle and be happy. And Montaigne says that there's an important difference here. So he says, sometimes it is the body that first surrenders to age, sometimes, too, it is the mind. And I have seen enough whose brains were enfeebled before their stomach and legs. And inasmuch as this is a malady hardly perceptible to the sufferer and obscure in its symptoms, it is all the more dangerous. For the time I complain of the laws, not that they leave us at work too long, but that they set us to work too late. It seems to me that considering the frailty of our life and how many ordinary natural reefs it is exposed to, we should not allow so great a part of it to birth idleness and apprenticeship. So I think this is the very important distinction here, is that when he's talking about solitude and also retirement, he's talking about disengaging from these other worldly obligations so that you can really kind of know yourself and engage in some of this deep intellectual work that he was doing during this 10-year period. It's not about sitting on a beach or sitting in your garden and letting the time pass. It's about truly removing all of these external forces upon your will, upon your emotions, upon your desires, and letting you express your more authentic self. And for Montaigne, that very authentic self was somebody deeply immersed in reading and learning. So let's talk a little bit about what he says about the value or limits of reading of books. This is obviously a podcast for book lovers or book curious people, and he has thoughts. He says, I do not speak the minds of others, expect to speak my own mind better. And this is kind of like what Schopenhauer was saying 2 weeks ago about how if you're constantly just regurgitating what other people have written, you're never really thinking for yourself. And that's why I think it's kind of cool what Montaigne does in his essays, where he weaves the quotations into his sentences so they very naturally flow. He's not saying, well, this person said this, and here's how I feel about it. He's saying what he feels and what he thinks, and then he's finding these other quotations out there that kind of already agree with it, which is actually very similar to the kind of writing that Schopenhauer set in his essays, is the type of writing you should look for when it's referencing other people. He goes on and he says, our tutors never stop bawling into our ears as though they were pouring water into a funnel, and our task is only to repeat what has been told us. I should like the tutor to correct this practice and right from the start, according to the capacity of the mind he has in hand, to begin putting it through its paces, making it taste things, choose them, and discern them by itself. Something clearing the way for him, sometimes letting him clear his own way. I don't want him to think and talk alone. I want him to listen to his pupil speaking in his turn. Socrates first had his disciples speak, and then they spoke to them. The authority of those who teach is often an obstacle to those who want to learn. So we're touching on some recurring ideas here around education. There's this big problem where we learn in school, and often we try to learn as adults by downloading information into our brain, right? Reading tons of books and trying to find the answers to our problems. When what Montaigne is saying, what Schopenhauer was saying, what was in Fun and Infinite Games, maybe John Gray said this, but it's this recurring idea that you have to go do things. You have to go try to figure it out yourself, and then the tutor can help you, or then you can find the book to answer the problems you run into. If you start with downloading information, then you're not actually learning, you're just regurgitating facts. He also has this kind of funny quip, similar to Schopenhauer, that a lot of people just waste their time learning useless stuff. It says, Plutarch says further that to appear so excellent in these less necessary qualities is to testify that one has misspent one's leisure and study, which should have been employed in more necessary and useful things. So that King Philip of Macedon, after hearing the great Alexander his son sing at a feast in an attempt to vie with the best musicians, said to him, aren't you ashamed to sing so well? And this kind of touches on that idea that constantly filling our brains with trivia that we don't particularly need or isn't useful for expressing whatever that best work of ourselves is kind of a waste of time. And it's this weird form of just trying to show off and get validation from things that we maybe just didn't even care about learning. There's not only no shame in not knowing things, there's almost a pride in focusing very intently on only learning and absorbing the information that is most important and most useful to you. And then he has a couple more quotations on actually reading books that I thought were really great. Where he says, I should certainly like to have a more perfect knowledge of things, but I do not want to buy it as dear as it costs. My intention is to pass pleasantly, and not laboriously, what life I have left. If I encounter difficulties in reading, I do not gnaw my nails over them. I leave them there after making 1 or 2 attacks on them. If I planted myself in them, I would lose both myself and time, for I have an impulsive mind. What I do not see at the first attack, I see less by persisting. This is a really interesting take on reading, and it's something that after I read this, I realized, oh, this is kind of what I do too, where if I get to a part of one of his essays, I definitely had to do this with the Zarathustra episode, where I just have no idea what's going on. I really don't try to force myself through it. I don't force myself to try to understand it, because when you're no longer enjoying reading it, or when it's no longer meshing with something already in your brain, you're probably not going to absorb it very well. You're not going to be able to tie it on to anything. So he's saying, like, try once, try again, and then if it still feels like you're forcing it and you don't get it, just move on, right? And you might not get everything out of a book, but if it's a great book, you'll come back to it. You should probably try to only read books that are worth revisiting, at least in some capacity. That's an interesting rule for what to skip in a book, right? Don't be afraid to skim if you kind of get stuck on some piece that you just don't get. You can always come back to it later. He also says that if the book wearies me, I take up another, and I apply myself to it only at the moments when the boredom of doing nothing begins to grip me. I do not take much to modern books because the ancient ones seem to me fuller and stronger. So he's saying 2 things here. 1, read older books, something that I'm trying to advocate with this podcast. And obviously, if you've noticed, basically every other book is at least a much older one. And if you get bored with a book, then just put it down and move on to something else. Very, very common advice from these deeply read people. They don't get stuck on books they don't enjoy. They put it down and they go to the next thing. One piece of advice he didn't include, but that I think is very useful, is using a tool like Readwise. So Readwise is what I use to pull all of my highlights out of these books and then organize all of them in my note-taking tool so that I can easily reference them later, find anything that I loved from the book to share with a friend, use in an article, whatever. I can just point my phone at the book, it scans the highlights for me, saves into my database, and then I can really easily find them in the future. They are giving 2 months free to listeners of the podcast. So if you go to readwise.io/nat, you can try it out. They also have, in my opinion, the best article reading tool with fantastic highlighting and everything built into it. So if you love reading, you should really try out Readwise. Just go to readwise.io/nat. All right, back to Montaigne. So now we get into some of Montaigne's advice for better living, for being happier. And some of this ties in with the ideas of solitude and retirement, but a lot of it also ties in with managing some of the more challenging parts of our brain, our psychology. And one of the things he talks about a lot is wealth and ambition. And one interesting difference with Montaigne and some other philosophers is that he doesn't say that you shouldn't try to get wealthy explicitly, or that you shouldn't pursue some ambition, but rather that you should do it. You should get those resources and then retire from all of it. You shouldn't let yourself get carried away with it. And he really clarifies this with this famous story of Thales, who was an ancient, I'm pretty sure, Roman philosopher who was always preaching about how wealth wouldn't make you happy and you'd get taken away by it. And, well, let me just tell you the story as he writes it. After Thales had several times criticized people's concern with managing a household and getting rich, they reproached him, saying that he was doing so like the fox because he could not attain these things. That reference is like the sour grapes fox, right? Can't reach the grapes, so he says the grapes aren't good anyway. Thales decided for fun to test this out, and making his learning stoop for this once to the service of profit and gain. He set up a traffic which within a year brought in such riches that hardly in their whole lifetime could the most experienced in that trade make as much. And the story, if I remember correctly, was that he probably got partially lucky, but sort of predicted that there would be an overly abundant olive harvest the next year. And so he rented all of the olive presses that he could get his hands on. And then when there were more olives than could possibly be pressed, the farmers had to rent them back from him at these exorbitant prices. So it's this interesting contrast and a little bit more honest too, because somebody like Seneca talks about, oh, you shouldn't go after wealth, but Seneca was basically the wealthiest person in Rome at the time. And Montaigne was obviously very wealthy too. And he's not saying that you shouldn't pursue wealth, but that you should almost do it quickly or do it just enough to provide for yourself for the rest of your life. He'd probably be a big fan of the FIRE movement, financial income, retire early, because he would say that's not what's going to make you happy, but it will be easier to be happy in solitude if you can be a little bit more comfortable. But obviously, as soon as you get wealthy, it becomes harder to be happy in these solitary states, or harder to not pursue greater riches. He says, once you get accustomed to a certain pile and set your fancy on it, it is no longer at your service. You wouldn't dare to make a dent in it. It is a building which seems to you ready to crumble altogether at a touch. Necessity must take you by the throat before you will cut into it. And neither I would pawn my clothes and sell a horse with much less reluctance and less regret than I would then make a breach in that beloved purse that I had laid by. But the danger lay in the fact that one cannot easily set fixed limits to this desire. They are hard to find in the things we consider good, and put a check on frugality. We go on ever fattening this pile and increasing it with one sum after another, until we deprive ourselves sordidly of the enjoyment of our own possessions, and place our only joy in keeping them and not using them. The men richest in money are those who have charge of guarding the gates and walls of a good city. And so what he's warning about is something, obviously, that we still talk about a lot today, this concept of loss aversion, right? Where once you have a certain amount of wealth, you're very afraid of losing it. You feel like you need to work harder and harder. You need to get more. You need to protect it. You don't want to use it. There's an interesting stat. This was talked about in Die with Zero by Bill Perkins. I know Ramit Sethi has talked about this too in his I Will Teach You to Be Rich podcast and such, where people who save properly often end up having more money than they can actually spend in retirement. They overdo it. And so they end up with all this extra money when they die that they just didn't need to save. They kind of wasted a certain amount of their life accumulating resources they don't need. And Montaigne is really kind of advising you against that, because it's so easy to get swept up in that desire for more because we get used to this stuff so quickly, lifestyle inflation, all of that. And he actually has this great older version of the fisherman parable, right? So the fisherman parable is basically that there's a guy on a beach, I think in Mexico or something, who goes out fishing every day, gets enough fish to sell and feed his family, and spends the rest of his time hanging out with them, singing with friends, cooking dinners, all of that. And a wealthy businessman from the US comes and says, oh, well, if you bought a bunch of boats and, built up your business and sold a lot more fish, then you could be wealthy, and then you could spend your time hanging out with your family and doing everything that he's doing right now. Right. And this is a much older version of it that I thought was a fun thing to find. He says, when King Pyrrhus was undertaking his expedition into Italy, Cineas, his wise counselor, wanting to make him feel the vanity of his ambition, asked him, well, sire, to what purpose are you setting up this great enterprise? To make myself master of Italy, he immediately replied. And then, continued Cineas, when that is done, I shall pass over into Gaul and Spain, said the other, and after that, I shall go and subdue Africa, and finally, when I have brought the world under my subjection, I shall rest and live content and at my ease. In God's name, sire, Cineas then retorted, tell me what keeps you from being in that condition right now, if that is what you want. Why don't you settle down at this very moment in the state you say you aspire to, and spare yourself all the intervening toil and risks? And then he has a quotation here from Lucretius, because he does not know the bounds of gain and where true pleasure stops and starts to wane. And I think this is one of the interesting, timeless questions with ambition, which is when we say something along the lines of, oh, I'm going to do this so that I can achieve this certain lifestyle. Do we actually want that lifestyle? Does King Pyrrhus actually want to settle down and relax, or is he justifying this other ambition to go conquer the world? This often gets talked about as, oh, the silly king, he could just settle down and he would be happy. But there's also this other question of, oh, well, maybe we're telling ourselves a false story, right? Maybe we're saying, oh, I need to go do these things so that I can relax and be content. But in reality, we're just addicted to going after more. And we're afraid to quit because we're, again, addicted to that pursuit of more and more and more. And he says, it is my opinion that if what a man has is enough to maintain the way of life to which he was born and brought up, it is folly to let go of it on the chance of increasing it. The man whom fortune denies a foothold and the means of arranging a calm and restful life is excusable if he tosses what he has to chance, since in any case, necessity sends him questing. It's this great, another kind of eternal question. Morgan Housel has a good version of it in Psychology of Money, where he says, don't risk what you have and need for what you don't have and don't need. And here we are, Montaigne saying the same thing, 500, 600 years earlier. So then one of the other big human emotions and motivations we have to watch out for is vanity. And this is another area where Montaigne is touching on ideas that we've kind of known for a long time, and we now have these modern psychology terms for them, but again, they've sort of always been in these philosophical texts. He says, whatever it is, whether art or nature, that imprints in us this disposition to live with reference to others, it does us much more harm than good. We defraud ourselves of our own advantages to make appearances conform with public opinion. We do not care so much what we are in ourselves and in reality as what we are in the public mind. Even the joys of the mind and wisdom appear fruitless to us if they are enjoyed by ourselves alone, if they do not shine forth to the sight and approbation of others. So again, he's advocating for this betterment of the self, this learning, really as an end in of itself, and avoiding these temptations of wealth and glory and now of vanity. And saying, like, don't learn things or do things just to get attention and love for others. You should be doing them for their own sake. And he goes on to say that one of the signs that you're valuing people, ideas, things outside of yourself more than your own values for their own sake is this desire for movement and change. Again, going back to the travel theme, he says, among human characteristics, this one is rather common, to be better pleased with other people's things than with our own, and to love movement and change. I have my share of that. Those who go to the other extreme of taking delight in themselves, of valuing what they have above other things, and recognizing nothing is more beautiful than what they see. If they are not wiser than we, they are in truth happier. I do not envy their wisdom, but I do their good fortune. This greedy appetite for new and unknown things indeed helps to foster in me the desire to travel, but enough other circumstances contribute to it. I gladly turn aside from governing my house. There is a certain satisfaction in being in command, were it only of a barn and in being obeyed by one's people, but it is too monotonous and languid a pleasure. And then it is necessarily mingled with many bothersome thoughts. Now the poverty and oppression of your tenants afflicts you, now a quarrel between your neighbors, now their encroachments upon you. And I think he's doing a good job here of showing how these things unravel, right? Where we might go change things or do things because we're very jealous of someone's fortune or because we want some certain lifestyle, but we only see the good, right? We don't see all of the bad things that come with it. We see the huge portfolio of houses that somebody owns, but we don't see them having to go unclog a toilet at 2 a.m. because they can't get a plumber. This is something he does a few times throughout the book or throughout the essays, and where he compares himself to the prior Stoics, and he says, maybe the extremely virtuous men of antiquity could simply shun these thoughts from their mind. Maybe they were that strong, but for me, I'm not. And so I need to use these other tricks at my disposal to save myself from these thoughts. So, trying to think through, okay, like, what am I not seeing in this thing that I'm jealous of can be very helpful in this example he's giving. And there's another one that you've probably heard, which is that you can only be jealous of their entire life. You can't just be jealous of a part of it. So unless you would completely trade your life for theirs, then being jealous of a certain part of it is kind of silly because you can't just get a tiny piece of someone's life. The other prescription he gives is he says that in all our fortunes, we compare ourselves with what is above us and look forward to those who are better off. Let us measure ourselves with what is below. There is no one so ill-starred that he may not find 1,000 examples to console him. It is our weakness that we are more unhappy to see people ahead of us than happy to see people behind us. Again, this is an idea that comes up very often, especially in Stoic philosophy, that anytime you catch yourself looking to someone ahead of you or more successful than you or whatever, think about all of the people who you are ahead of, and it will often make you feel better. And obviously, there are limits to how well some of these things work, right? It's hard to completely escape vanity, and I am certainly not immune from that. So if you're enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate it if you sent it to a friend, either the YouTube video or the audio on Spotify, Apple, wherever you're listening to it, because that is the best way for this to spread and for me to keep doing it. And if you already shared it, then make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube, leave a review on iTunes or Spotify. And again, that just really, really helps more people keep finding it and me to keep sharing these books with you. So now let's go on to this very important topic of husbanding your will. So this is, I believe the essay is titled, Of Husbanding Your Will. And it's all about trying to control these passions that can overtake us that we don't necessarily want to listen to. He says, the passions that distract me from myself and attach me elsewhere, those in truth I oppose with all my strength. We must husband the freedom of our soul and mortgage it only on the right occasions, which are in very small number if we judge sanely. See the people who have been taught to let themselves be seized and carried away. They do so everywhere, in little things as in big, in what does not touch them as in what does. They push in indiscriminately wherever there is business and involvement, and are without life when they are without tumultuous agitation. They are in business for business's sake. They seek business only for busyness. It is not that they want to be on the go so much as that they cannot keep still, no more nor less than a stone that has started falling and that does not stop until it comes to rest. So he's kind of stepping out into this meta topic of we often have these passions and desires that let us get carried away. We turn into like a stone rolling down a hill, just going and going and going and going because of inertia pulling us along. And we have to be aware of when that might be happening. When are we just continuing for the sake of continuing? And what are the passions that distract me from myself and attach me elsewhere that we need to fight? We've obviously talked about some of them, right? Like wealth and vanity, but this could really be anything. It's another piece of advice that you may have heard before, but he says that passions are as easy for me to avoid as they are hard for me to moderate. They are more easily torn from the mind than checked. He who cannot attain that noble impassibility of the Stoics, let him take refuge in the bosom of this plebeian stupidity of mine. What those men did by virtue, I train myself to do by disposition. The middle region harbors the tempests, the two extremes, philosophers and rustics, concur in tranquility and happiness. So instead of trying to moderate your pleasures, just avoid them. Abstinence is always going to be easier than moderation, something that I've certainly found true. And again, he's being kind of self-deprecating here, saying like, I'm not good enough to do these things in moderation. I just need to avoid them or else I'm going to fully indulge in them. One thing he says that's really important is that we shouldn't pretend that these vices are actually unenjoyable, right? So a common example of this is you might see somebody arguing that like, oh, I cut alcohol out of my life and I was so much happier. Life is so much better without it. You can actually have more fun without it. And I'm not saying that's not true, but they are probably on some level trying to pretend that they can have more fun without it to continue to convince themselves that it's worth avoiding. Instead, according to Montaigne, we should be honest that those things are very fun. They are very pleasurable and exciting to indulge in. And that is part of why we need to be temperate with them, why we need the moderation. He says, the worst of my actions and conditions does not seem to me so ugly as the cowardice of not daring to avow it. Everyone is discreet in confession. People should be so in action. Boldness in sinning is somewhat compensated and bridled by boldness in confessing. God grant that this excessive license of mine may encourage our men to attain freedom, rising above these cowardly and hypocritical virtues born of our imperfections, that at the expense of my immoderation I may draw them out to the point of reason. A man must see his vice and study it to tell about it. Those who hide it from others ordinarily hide it from themselves. And then he quotes Seneca and he says, why does no one confess his vices? Because he is still in their grip now. It is only for a waking man to tell his dream. And this is a very powerful way to frame it, I think. Like if a certain pleasure has its grip on you, you should be honest with yourself and others that it has that effect on you. And you don't need to pretend that, oh, it's actually not fun. You don't necessarily have to try to convince yourself otherwise. You should be honest about what your sins or what your vices are, because then you can have a more honest moderation of them. And he also goes so far as to say that the value of moderation and of temperance should be itself. It should not be an end for something else. He says, God must touch our hearts. Our conscience must reform by itself through the strengthening of our reason, not through the weakening of our appetites. Sensual pleasure is neither pale nor colorless in itself for being seen through dim and bleary eyes. We should love temperance for itself and out of reverence toward God, who has commanded it, and also chastity. What Catter lends us and what I owe to the favor of my colleague is neither chastity nor temperance. We cannot boast of despising and fighting sensual pleasure if we do not see or know it, and its charms, its power, and its most alluring beauty. And I love that quotation in particular because it feels like a bit of a contrast to some of the modern arguments for moderation and temperance, where you should avoid having any alcohol or don't have more than 2 drinks or 7 drinks or whatever the number is this week because it will protect your brain. It will help with fat loss. It will, yada, yada. And Montaigne is saying, no, you should just not do those things because they're bad. It doesn't need to have some other end. The moderation is itself an end. It's kind of the invoking of some religious practice almost around respecting your body, right? You don't need to justify moderation. Moderation is an end in itself. And I'm curious to see if we start to move more in that direction in modern culture, because it does feel like we have kind of elected these new religious leaders and adopted these new religious rituals that we call, health practices and things like that. But it's a lot of the same ideas, just kind of in new clothing. We should abstain from these things because it's just good to abstain from them. And then the last thing on this like health and moderation topic that I wanted to touch on, which I thought was such a really, really great point. And it was one of those lines where the minute I read it, I went, oh yeah, I mean, that's just so true. He says, I find myself more devout in good fortune than in bad, following the precept of Xenophon, if not his reason for it. And I am more apt to turn loving eyes to heaven in thanks than in request. I take more pains to improve my health when it smiles on me than I do to get it back when I have parted from it. Prosperity is discipline and education to me, as are adversities and rods to others. As if good fortune were incompatible with a good conscience, men never become good except in bad fortune. Good fortune, to me, is a singular spur to moderation and modesty. Prayer wins me, threats repel me. Favor makes me bend, fear makes me stiffen. And that idea in particular, that I find myself more devout in good fortune than in bad, or I take more pains to improve my health when it smiles on me than I do to get it back when I have parted from it. It feels so true. I've often noticed that, and I'm sure you've noticed this as well, the more regularly you are exercising, the easier it is to keep exercising. Once you stop drinking, the easier it is to continue not drinking. The activation energy is high, but once it's going, it's easier to continue that inertia than it is to start or stop again. And so there's another lesson embedded in that, which is that if we want to regain these things, health, fortune, whatever, we simply have to recognize that by starting, it will become easier to continue doing them. And I think it applies to a lot of this self-improvement, this diligence that he's talking about in these last few sections. And then the last of these topics that I wanted to touch on that I really enjoy is when he talks about the value of challenge. And it reminded me of this other book, The Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter, much more modern book, came out last year, the year before. I have a Made You Think podcast episode on it. But that book talks a lot about the value of challenges. And Montaigne is talking about how we should really perpetually find what our limits are, push ourselves beyond our limits. And this is one of the topics where you kind of see Montaigne's contradictions throughout his essays, because on the one hand, he's talking about living a relaxed, retired life of solitude, being one with your nature, not pushing too or not going too hard after things outside of you. But he also talks about how our desire is increased by difficulty. It's in the name of this essay. He starts by sharing this common piece of Stoic wisdom that no good can bring us pleasure unless it is one for whose loss we are prepared. Grief for something lost and fear of losing it amount to the same thing, meaning to prove that the enjoyment of life cannot be truly pleasant to us if we are in fear of losing it. Like a very common Stoic idea, right? Like you have to be willing and ready to die, right? To fully enjoy life. Memento mori. But he says, that doesn't totally make sense. He says, it might be said, however, on the contrary, that we clutch and embrace this good all the more tightly and with more affection because we see that it is less secure and fear that it may be taken from us. For we obviously sense that just as fire is stirred up by the presence of cold, so our will is whetted by opposition. And then a little bit further on, he says, it is the same way everywhere. Difficulty gives value to things. So we actually end up valuing things more if they're challenging to get, or if we have to struggle for them a little bit more. And he tells this story. He says, the people of the March of Ancona prefer to make their vows to St. James, and those of Galicia to Our Lady of Loreto. At Liege, they make much ado about the baths of Lucca, and in Tuscany about those of Spa. You see hardly a Roman in the fencing school at Rome, which is full of Frenchmen. That great man Cato found himself, just like the rest of us, wary of his wife as long as she was his, and desired her when she belonged to another man. So there is this interesting idea that maybe we don't enjoy things that we are ready to lose. We do need some fear of losing them to fully enjoy them. He has this funny quip where he says, what kept marriages in Rome so long in honor and security was everyone's freedom to break them off at will. They loved their wives the better because they might lose them, and with full liberty of divorce, 500 years and more passed before anyone took advantage of it. Seems unlikely that nobody got divorced for 500 years, but it is this interesting idea that the easier it is to abandon a partner or be abandoned by one, the more you will work to keep earning their love, hopefully. I think it could obviously be argued the other way, that the quicker you might just leave as soon as things get challenging. But there is this truth to this idea that the more challenging things are, the more we value them and the more we desire them. Because the last little thing on that is this idea that punishment and consequences can actually make things more desirable. It says, to this theme could be joined the opinion of an ancient that punishments rather whet vices than dull their edge. They do not engender a concern to do well, that is the work of reason and discipline, but only a concern not to be caught doing evil. Cut out the infected spot and wider spreads contagion. That's from Rutilius. I thought maybe I wouldn't have time to get to the stuff on education of children, but that touches on it a little bit, right? This problem where if you punish and if you disavow things, then it makes people want it more. And that's certainly true with kids, right? Like I certainly knew that the things I wasn't allowed to do were immediately more interesting and more enticing. And I think we see that everywhere. There's a term for this. I think it's reactance, right? Where as soon as you forbid somebody from doing something or tell them not to do something, they suddenly want to do it more. So I'll just share a couple other ideas from his essay on the education of children, because I thought it was quite good. So I shared the line about, not speaking the minds of others, speak my own mind better, about how tutors should encourage students to try things and then help them, not just tell them things and hope they absorb the information. But he also has this interesting idea that sounds weird, but we should train children to endure pain. Practice at enduring work is practice at enduring pain. Work hardens one against pain. That's a Cicero quotation. The boy must be broken into the pain and harshness of exercises to build him up against the pain and harshness of dislocation, colic, cauterization, and the dungeon and torture. For he may yet be a prey to the last two, which threaten the good as well as the bad in a time like this. This is kind of an interesting idea that I find pretty compelling, that you should expose children to a lot of challenge, especially physical challenge at work, because it will toughen them up for later in life and they'll be able to endure the challenges and harshnesses of life more easily, right? You obviously don't want to overdo it. You don't want to leave them out in the cold, but if you never force them to struggle a little bit, force them to push themselves, then they'll never be able to rise to those challenging occasions later in life. And he's actually saying that not just the parents, but the schools should do this. Schools should have these, it sounds like either rigorous athletics where they're really being pushed hard physically, but also maybe challenging work that they really have to, again, prove to themselves that they can do these hard things. I have an essay about that on my blog. If you search prove you can do hard things, you can find it. But aside from teaching them to do hard things, he also says that one of the things we really want to instill is this curiosity. And I think one of the unfortunate things about education today is that because it's so focused on memorization, regurgitation, performing and getting grades, it actually makes learning something that kids don't want to do anymore. It makes them dislike learning. But Montaigne says, put into his head an honest curiosity to inquire into all things. Whatever is unusual around him, he will see. A building, a fountain, a man, the field of an ancient battle, the place where Caesar or Charlemagne passed. He will inquire into the conduct, the resources, and the alliances of this prince and that. These are things very pleasant to learn and very useful to know. There's a line I've heard with parenting. It's along the lines of encourage, don't push. Right. So whatever you find your kid might be interested in, you want to encourage them to keep pursuing that, keep learning, keep exploring it. You don't want to force them to explore or learn or do something just because you think it's important or because that was what you did when you were a kid. And if you can encourage them to pursue their interests and the things they're curious and excited about, then you can foster that love of learning, that love of exploration. But if you quell that by pushing them into these other things they might not care about, then they might just lose that curiosity for learning altogether. And then he ends with another line kind of on that topic where he says, to return to my subject, there is nothing like arousing appetite and affection. Otherwise, all you make out of them is asses loaded with books. By dint of whipping, they are given their pocketful of learning for safekeeping. But if learning is to do us any good, we must not merely lodge it within us, we must espouse it. So this is a fantastic essay on education of children. If you have kids, this might be a good one to start with, just because I think it's particularly good and it can be a nice entry into Montaigne. But there's a ton more in here. The essays are really wonderful. You can kind of pick them up and go through them at your own leisure. So I do recommend picking it up, even if you don't think that you would read all of them. If you enjoyed this, please share it with a friend. That is the best way for the podcast to grow and for me to be able to keep doing this. If you want to support the show more directly, go to readwise.io/net and sign up for Readwise. It's my favorite reading tool. I use it basically every day. It's essential for getting the most out of these wonderful books that I'm sharing with you. Aside from that, make sure you leave a review on Spotify or iTunes, like and subscribe on YouTube. Any of those little metric-y things to help make this do better in the algorithms is a really, really great way to support the show. Aside from that, I will see you next week with another book for Netsness.